Hare Om Namaha. By the mid-80s, fanaticism and reliability became issues in so-called ISKCON. Too much of one and not nearly enough of the other. The second and third echelon fanatics were confronted with an unexpected problem. The gurus, which energized their fanaticism, were being exposed as frauds. They had placed blind and fervent faith in those so-called perfect men, but it was being demonstrated on a regular basis that their faith was misplaced. Of course, this was the case for only some of them. Besides the rank and file that had no position one way or the other, amongst all the loyalists, there was an unspoken in-house split within so-called ISKCON. On one hand, there were the party men who adhered to the GBC and not the gurus, as the GBC being the source of legitimacy and connection to the Guru Parampara. By the late 70s and the early 80s, those who believed this constituted a minority report. Nevertheless, it was a substantial subset of the movement. At every center in the world, with the notable exception of the Krishna Bolaram complex in Ramanreti, India, the gurus and their men were the be-all and end-all in the eyes and minds of this majority faction. That spirit, however, was being severely tested in the mid-80s. A significant number of devotees yearned for a solution to the developing situation in which the gurus, their gurus, were being exposed. So-called gurus. In our running commentary of 11 Naked Emperors, henceforward referred to by its acronym ENE, which was and is the second major publication of Henry Doktorsky, we now reach chapter 11. The previous chapter was a bridge between the ninth and the one we now analyze. This one, chapter 11, contains more substance. In no small part, that is because during the years 1984 and 1985, so-called ISKCON and its fanatics were being rocked by a perfect storm. 8 new gurus had been added previous to and during those years. The zonal system of principalities for the great enjoyers was thus breaking down. Nevertheless, all 19 of them still took utterly undeserved Uttama Udhikari worship from their improperly initiated disciples. However, the Guru's remaining godbrothers and godsisters, who were genuinely initiated by Prabhupada himself, an ever-dwindling lot, obviously, were not worshiping those gurus anymore. At least not very many of them were doing so. This provoked doubt in the new people, all of whom barely grasped the spiritual science. These newcomers, with some exceptions, had little contact with their own spiritual masters. As such, they relied upon their temple presidents and the advanced members of the local congregation to be representatives of their so-called gurus. Or they relied more upon a local sannyasi who bivouacked at a given center. The first wave, one of the waves of this perfect storm, was that many, if not most of these presidents and sannyasis, outside the inner sanctum of the approved Diksha gurus, were beginning to have doubts about what had been imposed on their movement since the spring of 1978. some of these malcontents were expressing those doubts. Some were having meetings where those doubts were being discussed amongst themselves. Even if the doubts weren't being outwardly expressed, these sannyasis and presidents were no longer fired up about any of the gurus, including the zonal who was featured at the center which they ran on his behalf. This was an ever-increasingly problematic situation for the gurus because they were all enjoyers. They depended upon local sannyasis and those temple presidents to keep the gurus, disciples, faithful and loyal to them. They depended upon the local sannyasis and their temple presidents of their zones, for those who still had zones, for their disciples to stay in those centers, in those zones, and be productive, especially in the matter of collections. The gurus wanted nothing to do with management. However, the management which these gurus depended upon was becoming jeopardized because the presidents, at least many of them in America, were doubting the whole arrangement now. Even if they did not openly express that doubt, their lack of enthusiasm vibed it to the newcomers. This first wave of the perfect storm hitting the, air quotes, ISKCON gurus was tough enough for the gurus. But there was more than this that was hitting them. The second wave buffeting the deviated cult was that of Mutt and its allegiance to Swami B.R. Sridhar of Navadvip. This was an outgrowth from second echelon, air quotes, ISKCON men. They were led to this new faction by the foolish decision of the GBC to promote Swami B.R. Sridhar into something he never was. While Prabhupada was physically manifest, Swami B.R. Sridhar was not at all prominent in the movement. He was more or less a nobody in it. Almost no one in the rank and file knew anything about him, or even his name. That would change when the vitiated GBC used him in order to formulate and form their zonal imposition. It was Swami B.R. Sridhar who coined the bromide, quote, äcärya of the zone, unquote, which then got converted into the term used in so-called ISKCON, namely zonal äcärya. It was Swami B.R. Sridhar who used the Bengali slogan, Mat Guru Si Jagaguru, in order to allege that the guru, even if he is only a Madhyam Udhikari, must be seen by the disciple as a Mahabhagavat and worshipped accordingly. There were so many of these tropes. All of them were manufactured ideas meant to spoil Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness. Although this was not recognized by the leading secretaries. Instead, these manufactured ideas became the basis of a transformation that indeed spoiled the Krishna consciousness movement that Prabhupada gave us. So-called ISKCON and its GBC followed that bad advice from Navadvip. They followed all of the man's bad advice, as a matter of fact. This would bite them big time in the early 80s, and that pain would only worsen by the mid-80s. With the exception of Jayatirtha, who obviously was a first echelon man, an ever-growing number of the second echelon, air quotes, ISKCON stalwarts, quote-unquote, crossed the river and joined the Navadvip cult of Gaudiya Mutt. They became a new branch of Gaudiya Mutt. Initially, they adopted as their label the Maha Mandala. They are now known as the World Vaishnava Association. None of this would have transpired had not so-called ISKCON bestowed all of that prominence in the spring of 1978 on the Navadvip Mahant. They used him at that time, but inadvertently made him out to be the father figure guru of the new gurus, since his manufactured ideas were adopted entirely by Ocean's 11. By the mid-80s, when the legitimacy of the zonal imposition and its opulent worship scheme was being profoundly questioned, Mutt was stirring the pot. It was recruiting more stalwarts, such as the influential Tripurari Swami, who at that time was president at San Francisco. The Great Schism of 1982, although certainly necessary, did not stop this second wave from crashing into so-called ISKCON when it was even more vulnerable in the mid-80s. For a while, it appeared as if the cult would crater. Swami B.R. Sridhar was making propaganda against it, as he had been doing even before the schism. The needle in and the damage done. He had said, quote, Ritvik äcärya, then it becomes as good as äcärya, unquote. The GBC accepted this, which got parlayed into Ritviks, automatically becoming gurus, who then automatically must be Uttamas, who then were automatically successors to Prabhupada in the disciplic succession. Outrageous. The Navadvip Mahant advocated for an äcärya board within the vitiated GBC. That also was adopted by the commish, believing that the non-guru faction cannot have any authority to rule over, chastise, punish, correct, or even advise the new gurus. This made Ocean's 11 untouchable. It was never the intention of Prabhupada, but it was Swami B.R. Sridhar's vision in the form of his advice, all of which was swallowed hook, line, and sinker and converted into the first transformation. By the mid-80s, a Neo-Mutt center had been created in Santa Cruz by Thira Krishna, the former temple president at Los Angeles. This second Neo-Mutt wave was recruiting and hitting the so-called ISKCON cult very hard. And this wave had its own rationalization as to why things were going awry in so-called ISKCON. Neo-Mutt preached that all of the problems were due to so-called ISKCON not strictly following Swami B.R. Sridhar. Ironically, just the opposite was the actual truth. So many of the problems the cult was being harmed by in the mid-80s was due to imbibing and implementing all of that disastrous advice from the Navadvip Mahant. Neo-Mutt had now become the, air quotes, ISKCON nemesis. Neo-Mutt was and remains against the teachings of Krishna consciousness brought to the West by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada, particularly in relation to Prabhupada's Siddhanta that the Jivatma originated in the spiritual world of form and activity, not from the Brahmajyoti. Devotees in general were now being misled by both of these warring cults. The third wave of the perfect storm hitting so-called ISKCON in the mid-80s consisted of what may be called the outsiders. These were the initiated men and women of the movement, none of them higher than the third echelon while they were in it, who left it. Many of them were not kicked out, but could not tolerate the deviation imposed when Ocean's 11 came back from India in the spring of 1978 with that new dispensation. This third wave comprised those who chose to take action, not to remain silent about what was going down. Most of those who left the cult of the new gurus, or were directly or indirectly driven out, just went away on their own. They created no ripples or spiritual sequence. Many of them threw out the baby with the bathwater and became non-devotees again, taking up their previous lifestyles. But this third wave was a factor in the mid-80s, although it was ostracized, ignored, and mostly kept away from the, air quotes, ISKCON centers. The third wave took action. It was a kind of a subterranean movement. Their position papers hit hard and tackled formerly taboo subjects. The quote-unquote underground Hare Krishnas, as one Hindu newspaper labeled them, punched above the weight of their limited numbers. They made propaganda both of the verbal and written variety. Your host speaker was part of this contingent. Position papers were produced. There was no internet yet, so this preaching did not spread quickly, but it did spread. These dedicated disciples, from one perspective, had been put into a lose-lose situation at the onset of the zonal äcärya scheme. They chose the lesser of two evils, as staying within the cult required buying into its unauthorized transformation, which they were not willing to do. The February 1979 confrontation at the Krishna Balaram complex in Ravéndra, discussed previously in one of our podcasts, was the leading edge of this third wave. This third wave was anti-Neo-Mutt, however, and it had to be distinguished from any allegiance to Swami B.R. Sridhar and Gaudiya Mutt. Neo-Mutt was unable to recruit these particular outsiders who stayed true to Prabhupada's tattva, siddhanta, and process. This third wave was a factor in the mid-80s, although it was ostracized, ignored, and mostly kept away. With these three waves of a perfect storm hitting ISKCON, so-called ISKCON, in the mid-80s, the cult was reeling. It needed a savior. It needed a savior badly. And although he was imperfect and did not tackle or uproot the real problem, that savior emerged in the form of Ravindra Svarup Das Udhikari. In 1984, Professor Blueblood issued a position paper entitled, quote, Ending the Fratricidal War, unquote. He insisted that it was only meant for a handful of his close associates, as he was a temple president at the top of the second echelon of so-called ISKCON. However, your host speaker doubts that this was his intention. Instead, I'm quite convinced he issued it so that it would spread like wildfire, which it did, although it could not have had as much impact or immediate effect as it would have had if the internet had existed then, which it didn't. Thus, Ravindra became the leader of what he called a revolution. However, this is a mislabel. He was only the immediate leader of an incipient development. It was never a revolution. It was never a rejuvenation. It was not a return to square one. It was always nothing more than a reform, a transformation, an unauthorized transformation. As we shall see, his tracks against the new gurus got him appointed by the GBC as the 19th institutional Diksha guru in the cult. Did he expect this? Was this actually unexpected? How could it be? He was expert at understanding institutional cause and effect, and he admitted that he had to accept a leadership role in his so-called revolution. That would mean being a guru, of course. Now, he had a couple of assets that other men in the cult did not. For starters, he claims, and it's likely true, that he was never a hippie. Fine. Although they were Prabhupada's best customers. As already mentioned, He was an established professor at a well-known university in Philadelphia, where he was temple president. These assets were utilized and manipulated well by him. He had peers who would back him in his reform effort, so-called revolution. And, the reform was ultimately successful because it did transform so-called ISKCON into something different. We find the following excerpt in chapter 11 of E&E. Quote, "When we got the gurus, we got 11 different ISKCONs," unquote. Ravindra Svarup confirmed. Quote, "There was some real unfriendly tensions between the gurus right from the start. They propped each other up because if the power of one guru was threatened, they all felt threatened. But when somebody finally fell, they turned on him and destroyed him." That's called the cult eating its own. But this was the essence of Ravindra's main argument, to wit, the movement had become a sole äcärya movement instead of a united confederation under the GBC. According to his vision, there were 11 sole äcäryas, and the movement was thus cut into pieces since the preaching, mood, and worship systems varied from zone to zone. It was a reasonably powerful argument, but it was a diversion. It was illogical. It was not as legitimate as you might have first surmised when you heard it. All 11 of those great pretenders were dependent upon GBC and Primature in order to keep their scams going. They were not as free as Ravindra made them out to be. He probably intuited this. Even if he didn't, he acted upon what he imposed as a fact, this division, and how he did so in his position papers is integral to how he brought them down and introduced the collegiate compromise of the Second Transformation. The movement was not 11 separate ones. In point of fact, it was a quasi-centralized scheme with its 11 of its most powerful at the top. In summary, he pushed an illusion and a diversion, but Professor Blueblood was an astute writer, and he had significant influence. He was also expert at projecting a particular emotion. This basic and fundamental emotion will be directly presented near the end of our presentation today. It was used by all of them to great effect, and Ravindra also was an adept at it. Besides this, a key plank of his new manifesto for so-called ISKCON was that it had degenerated into a neophyte cult. The implication to this, which was a false presupposition, is that it previously was dominated by fixed-up devotees, which would mean that they had to have been madhyams. They weren't. But he was saying that they were, indirectly. As such, he was saying that the zonal äcärya imposition was now run by neophytes who are intrinsically envious, and that this quote-unquote sole äcärya system needed to be made unified once again. Then it would automatically revert, allegedly, to its former status as a worldwide unified congregation guided by advanced devotees loyal to its GBC. Now, all kinds of falsity was embedded in this presupposition. Were they formerly madhyams? They were not, and the track record proves it. Were they, the 11 great pretenders, only neophytes? Would abandonment of the zonal äcärya system and replacing it with a commission-centric model automatically produce a movement run by madhyams? History proves that it did not. after the second transformation gained power. E&E quotes your host speaker as follows on this topic. Quote, Ravindra is claiming that ISKCON, and that society was certainly so-called ISKCON by 1984 and 1985, was a Kanishta Adhikari society. It was not. It was led by charismatic Sahajiyas. These men were not Kanishtas. In point of fact, with perhaps a temple president here and there that may still have been Kanishta, all the leaders of so-called ISKCON by 1984 and 85 were either Sahajiyas or mixed devotees. Mixed devotees are far lower than Kanishta bhaktas, but few devotees know this bhakti science, unquote. This may appear to be radical to you, but the actual fact is that it may be too soft. Some of them may not have even been Sahajiyas by the mid-80s. Remember, although very deviated and fallen, Sahajiyas are nevertheless still devotees. Some of those 11 men, as well as some of the 8 others who captured the Gaudiya after them by the mid-80s, may have become either covert Mayavadis or out-and-out materialists. There is plenty in and on the record to indicate this potential. Quote, the Guru Reform Movement, unquote. The Guru Reform Movement was not only the title of Chapter 11 of E&E, but it was also a subheader within the chapter. There's a major misconception embedded in this idea, although it was considered that, a Guru Reform Movement by the mid-80s. The real Guru is never in need of reform. The Guru must be a very perfect man. The movement he founds, if it has not severely deviated from him, that movement may require reform. However, the Guru is never in need of correction or reform. If he is fallen, and previously a genuine Guru, then he needs to elevate himself back to the perfectional stage. However, the implication of the Guru Reform Movement in so-called ISKCON was not referring to that. It was referring to men who were still improperly initiating new disciples, but remained institutionally approved gurus. By the term, quote-unquote, Guru Reform Movement, what is being referred to in Chapter 11 of E&E is the initial and rather tepid emergence of the temple presidents who were protesting the Uttama Adhikari worship program integral to the cult. Professor Blueblood was preeminent amongst them, and he penned the initial position papers which started the ball rolling. This was distinctly different from the rebellion at Ramanreti in 1979, and it was the chief point, so-called Guru Reform, made by E&E in Chapter 11. Here's an excerpt verifying this fact. Quote, this was the first time large numbers of devotees with real political power, the ISKCON temple presidents, began organizing together to combat the menace. Actually, for many years, the temple presidents had been a formidable force in ISKCON. Although they had no legal power over the GBC, sometimes they had exerted their influence, unquote. The movement by the mid-80s was starting to crater, and Professor Blueblood's first position paper lit the fuse. From his own words, as excerpted in E&E, quote, Ravindra Svarup recalled, in the autumn of 1984, a routine meeting of the temple presidents of North America led to a collective and public acknowledgement that nearly everyone held deep private misgivings about the manner in which the position of quote-unquote guru had been established in ISKCON. They organized an immediate second meeting to further consider the issue and thus the Guru reform movement was born. With the engagement of a significant number of second-tier leaders, men whose loyalty to ISKCON was not in doubt, a credible and potent movement was established. The majority of North American temple presidents believed something was drastically wrong, unquote. This was the same time frame in which Ravindra issued his first position paper, so none of it was accidental. He knew how to play them, and he was already the first amongst equals on the second echelon. The acceptance of his arguments solidified this power for him. E describes the situation in so-called ISKCON at the time quite well. Quote, when new devotees began to take initiation from the zonal äcäryas, the power of the temple presidents eroded. They no longer could motivate devotees to follow their direct instructions, let alone their vision. The new disciples often looked down on the temple presidents, especially if they were householders, and consequently, they rebelled in subtle and less than subtle ways against the temple president's authority, unquote. Such was also the case for the non-guru contingent of the GBC. Their zones became meaningless. The guru zones of the zonal äcäryas was all that the newcomers considered important, or even legitimate. As genuinely initiated devotees of Prabhupada kept departing from so-called ISKCON, the idea that there was legitimacy to a non-guru GBC at any given center or temple became, for all practical purposes, an anachronism. It was costly, in terms of airfare and other accoutrements, for a non-guru GBC or even a temple president to attend meetings in distant parts of America, what to speak of overseas in India. That these members of the second echelon of the cult were dependent upon the pick to cover those expenses did not sit well with those who did the pick. The new disciples, all improperly initiated, didn't want the money they collected, by nefarious means in many cases, to be used by leaders who are now fighting against their own gurus. Tattvamasi. Air quotes, ISKCON loyalists were now forced to come to some tough realizations. One of them, who eventually became completely disloyal, changing his name and status after joining Mutt, commented as follows in E&E. Quote, practically the present ISKCON leaders don't have truly Brahminical advisors anymore, because everybody in their zone has something to lose and thus will leave or shut up. Even though gurus in the GBC amongst themselves and in public will discredit and condemn each other, officially there is no one who can question an äcärya in his zone, nor is there anybody to consult in such difficulties, unquote. The temple presidents began outwardly expressing their disgust about what they had repressed for years. They wanted to get together, and thus they had a meeting in New Jersey. Word got out. And then the actual base emotion, which we've referenced previously, which controlled everything, came to the fore. As excerpted from E&E, here's an example of that base emotion in the words of a major organizer of those initial meetings, namely Vishnu Gada. Quote, however, after we scheduled our next meeting for sometime in the spring of 1985, we immediately got blackballed by a group of gurus. My recollection is that temple presidents were forbidden to attend the next meeting. It was quite a shock to me, unquote. Do you pick up on the emotion underlying this? We shall specify it subsequently. Ravindra, as aforementioned, was also expert at utilizing it. There should have been nothing shocking about it. We all had to experience it. We all experienced it. The cult was a tyranny of both thought and action. You were subject to condemnation and excommunication if you did not accept the self-apotheosis of the quote-unquote new gurus, although they were never actually spiritual masters. Their false statuses as so-called successors to Prabhupada could not be questioned by anyone below the level of the vitiated GBC. And the äcärya board of the GBC also kept them from being challenged, although that broke down eventually. Which brings us to the Moundsville compound, aka New Vrindavan, in August and September of 1985. There would be meetings each of those months there at that time. These were not solely temple presidents' meetings, although many presidents, Ravindra being one of them obviously, attended at least the second one. The first one was technically a GBC emergency meeting called by mostly the American commissioners, as something had to be done. Of course, it really wasn't. ENE records that first one as follows, quote, in August 1985, the North American GBC temple presidents and 11 ISKCON gurus attended a 2-day emergency meeting at New Vrindavan to discuss issues such as the development of a constitution, expanding the number of gurus, discussing the role of the spiritual master within ISKCON, and evaluating the qualifications of current and future gurus, unquote. Ravindra confirmed that his second position paper was integral to that meeting. Actually, it was also integral to the next one a month later. ENE quotes him as follows, quote, under my order, Reflections on the Guru and ISKCON, that's the title of the second position paper, became accepted as the position paper of the reform movement. And the paper's thesis helped lead, 2 years later, to the formal dismantling of the zonal äcärya system, unquote. Indeed it did. Professor Bluebud's first position paper, Ending the Fratricidal War, was well received and circulated by so-called ISKCON presidents and other malcontents. However, his second position paper carried more weight. The first meeting in August was not that well known. The September meeting was very well attended as word got out that the opulent worship arrangement was now going to be challenged. In point of fact, your host speaker thought for years that there was only one conclave in the late summer of 1985, but there actually were 2 of them. Not much progress was made on formulating or forming a new constitution in either of those meetings. The 2 issues that were confronted, to a significant extent, were both related, one general and one specifically. The specific one centered on Bhavananda. The general topic centered on the guru system advocating for its reform. After conclusive evidence presented as to Bhavananda's homosexual activities while he was allegedly a guru, he was suspended from initiating for 6 months. Bhavananda was also put on probation by the Privilege Committee. At the September conclave, it was determined that he would again be examined at the annual GBC meeting in 1986. The writing was on the wall. Except for Kirtanananda, the high-flying gurus were all being busted down to dedicated party men. One by one, they were bailing from a sinking ship of fools. Aside from Bhavananda's malfeasance being exposed, along with the cult having disciplined 3 of the 11 gurus previously in the early part of the decade, things were starting to tear apart. The center was not holding. The GBC was supposed to be that center. However, it was, to a significant but not complete degree, controlled by the new gurus up to that time. Ravindra's opposition had to be ameliorated somehow, or at least compromised. As such, practically out of nowhere and without him going through the bureaucratic process, Ravindra was awarded guru status at the September conclave. Bhavananda took some responsibility for his illicit homosex, but he also blamed the guru system, which, however you cut it, was instituted by the governing body. He blamed it for his massive deviations. He pleaded that there was really no intention on his part to do things like that in a bad way. No bad intention. E&E reproduces one of Hansadutta's former disciples commenting on that Bhavananda plea. Quote, "This is something like the fox saying he had no ill intention when entering the henhouse. Of course, those who have committed crimes will attempt to claim innocence," unquote. To his credit, Doktorsky in Chapter 11 covers both the micro and the macro. He gives us important details to and for the historical record. He also allowed all of his readers access to essential overviews of not only what was going down in so-called ISKCON, but why. He quotes your host speaker as follows to explain some of that why. Quote, "The party men are masters at creating doubt and guilt, masters of deception, masters at bewilderment, masters at enticement, masters at pseudo-persuasion, and when the situation calls for it, masters at harassment and various psychic punishments. They have their own spheres, both gross and subtle. The various followers who are weak in knowledge, weak in mind control, and weak in yogic development can hardly escape the network of the party men once they become entangled in it. The party men buttress this astral network via the buildings, deities, vehicles, properties, and money on the gross plane, and those innocent but foolish devotee followers are completely trapped by them and their manifestations," unquote. Besides Bhavananda and the Guru issue, Kirtanananda blackballed the whole effort. He issued a paper to counter Ravindra, and mostly nothing of substance came from this follow-up meeting with his peers at Moundsville. Kirtanananda told his disciples to consider all of his godbrothers to be nothing more than the Rotary Club. Of course, there were some notable exceptions. Professor Blueblood became a commission-approved spiritual master at the second multi-day meeting, even though he had no disciples ready for initiation at his center. That brought to 5 the number of new gurus added by 1985, along with the 3 which were added earlier in the 80s, totaling 8. Secondly, the vitiated GBC made a list of resolutions to bring to Mayapur in the spring of 1986 to be voted on, which meant, in effect, kicking the can down the road and buying more time. Meanwhile, although this was a developing situation throughout America, hardly any of the devotees elsewhere in the world knew about it. One exception to this, although he heard about the controversy later, was Jayanta Krit in France. He was a second echelon man. In the beginning zonal years, he was quite dedicated to Bhagavan, who was one of the most gung-ho and egregious of all the high-profile gurus. Jayanta Krit was dealt with severely by Bhagavan when he, Jayanta Krit, went to the other side of the guru controversy. In the short term, he wound up opening his own center, unaffiliated with so-called ISKCON, in southern France. As such, he followed the same path as Theodore Krishna in America, who opened up that aforementioned separate center in Santa Cruz. However, there was one big difference, since the one in California was a Neo-Mutt center. As fate would have it, Jayanta Krit soon joined Neo-Mutt and became dedicated to Swami B.R. Sridhar. We shall be reproducing excerpts from him in a later presentation of this series. Suffice it to say that he and I are not only on opposite sides, but inimical to one another. You will find out about that soon enough. E&E, via the following excerpt, shared Jayanta Krit's transformation to a completely different viewpoint from Bhagavan in 1985. Quote, I opened a small preaching center in southern France and started to communicate with my godbrothers everything I had learned in the USA about the äcärya issue. They were all flabbergasted because no information on that topic had ever made it from abroad to the devotees at large in France and in the rest of Bhagavan's zone. Between that meeting and Mayapur, Bhagavan spent thousands of dollars on phone calls all over the world to rally the troops for a counter-reform. In Mayapur, he gave a lecture quoting a verse from the Srimad Bhagavatam, according to which those envious persons who criticize the Vaishnavas will remain in hell as long as the sun and moon exist, unquote. Notice the method used by Bhagavan. F, E, A, R, fear. This was always the foundation upon which Ocean's 11 utilized and did everything. This was that base emotion referred to previously. Most everything else was window dressing, meant to attract followers and keep at least a handful of godbrothers on board for the purpose of upkeep and management of the centers. However, when the rubber met the road, it always came down to fear. Doktorsky is to be commended for this chapter in his book. It was thorough, painstakingly researched, and it revealed facts and truths that otherwise would have merged into oblivion. Well done. In summation, the revelations in the late summer of 1985 that Bhavananda had seduced a teenage boy gave the Guru Reform Party encouragement and determination to challenge the high-flying zonals. As a backlash, the vitiated GBC, which was mostly controlled by the Great Pretenders, of course, legislated and imposed various political roadblocks so that the reformers could not make much progress. Quote, the GBC knew the zonal äcärya gig was up, but they had to act fast to save themselves and keep their power as best they could. The GBC enacted measures to restrain the temple presidents and the opposition movement. They gave every GBC member the right to appoint 2 people in their zones to participate in the upcoming Mayapur meetings with voting rights. However, the GBC did not appoint temple presidents who were opponents to the zonal äcärya system. They appointed sycophants, unquote. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. Let us close this month's presentation with the following excerpt from Prabhupada. Quote, so don't spoil the movement by manufacturing ideas. Don't do that. Go on in the standard way and keep yourself pure. Then this movement is sure to be successful. But if you want to spoil it by whimsical, then what can be done? It will be spoiled. If you manufacture whims and disagree and fight amongst yourself, then it will be another edition of these so-called movements. It will lose the spiritual strength." Unquote. Sadeva Samya